Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Sumeracki from Rhode Island College, and in this office hours video, I'm going to talk about a paper that was published by Jennifer Brigati and colleagues in 2020. The paper was titled, "How Do Undergraduates Cope with Anxiety Resulting from Active Learning Practices in Introductory Biology?" I was looking at this paper because it talks about cold calling. And cold calling is something that I have been interested in, related to retrieval practice and just general use in the classroom. And I've written a little bit about it on our blog on learningscientist.org. And whenever I write about it, someone usually asks me questions about it and wants to hear more. And so I've been kind of poking around and looking at cold calling papers. There don't appear to be all that many of them, at least not in the PsycInfo database, though I'm sort of slowly going through what I can find. But I was really interested in this paper because it's a bit different from the types of papers that I typically read. This is actually a paper that is descriptive in nature. So they are using surveys and open-ended prompts to analyze qualitative student responses related to active learning strategies that are used in introductory biology. And those strategies are also strategies that are used in a lot of different classes in higher education and also in K through 12. But we can't determine cause and effect from this paper. It's descriptive, so it gives us a sense of how the students report feeling and what they report doing, which can really be great to understand students' experiences and sort of get a rich understanding, especially with that sort of exploratory, qualitative research method. And it can spark interest in future research questions and help us sort of figure out what questions we even need to ask. So anyway, that's why I was looking at this paper. And they really were interested in understanding, summarizing how anxious students typically feel when they engage in these active learning strategies in their classes, specifically those introductory biology classes, and then what coping strategies the students use to kind of get through that experience. And they classified the coping strategies as either adaptive or maladaptive. And so this is interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this paper and the findings today, and I'm going to put it up as an office hours video so that those of you on Patreon can gain kind of early access to my thoughts and to get that video format if you're interested in that. And then I'm going to publish a written piece about this in the blog in the future. So the active learning practices that Brigati and colleagues were looking at were things like using clickers to have students respond in class, using group work, having students volunteer to answer questions. So this is, posing a question, waiting for a student to raise their hand and calling on that student, or cold calling, which is where you pose a question to the class, but then you randomly pick a student to answer the question. You don't wait for a student to volunteer. You choose them, and then they then need to volunteer. And the way I've used cold calling in the past in my classes, but then also in my research, is to promote or even a little bit force, or at least very strongly encourage, that's probably a better phrase, strongly encourage covert retrieval. So if I pose a question to the class and I wait for a volunteer, then the students might just sort of sit around and kind of wait to see who's going to volunteer and answer the question. They might not try to retrieve the answer on their own. Whereas if I'm going to cold call, everyone has to kind of think about the answer and try to covertly retrieve that answer before I select an individual. And so everybody benefits, or more people, I should say, benefit from that retrieval practice activity than if I just allowed the student to volunteer, because more people are then engaging in that covert retrieval. But of course, the concern with this is that it might produce more anxiety. And the research cited by Brigati and colleagues indicates that students do tend to report feeling pretty anxious when cold calling is used in the class. So in this survey, They asked the students how anxious they feel during these various activities, that previous surveys from their introductory biology courses indicated that the strategies were used in the vast majority of intro bio classes. And the students in the survey confirm as well that they're being used. They had the option of saying, this isn't used in my class, rather than provide an anxiety response. And so they indicated how anxious they feel when they do any one of these four things. So the volunteering to answer questions, cold calling, clickers, or group work. And then the students were given open-ended questions about how they cope with, how they deal with their anxiety when these strategies are being implemented in their classes. And the students could list all different types of strategies, coping strategies, and they were classified into being adaptive or maladaptive. So adaptive coping responses were things like seeking support from peers, taking deep breaths to try to calm yourself down, using positive self-talk, preparing for class to make a person less anxious so they feel like they're ready to go, asking a classmate or a TA, repeating the question in their own words or other type of problem solving, just doing the very best that they can, etc. The maladaptive strategies involved primarily things like escape responses. So not answering, just don't answer or just decide you're going to lose points. Don't raise your hand, randomly guess, talk as little as possible, avoid eye contact, those types of things. And those are maladaptive because they're not really going to help deal with the anxiety in a way that would promote learning, whereas the adaptive strategies, they are probably healthier and result in sort of working through the material, and it should result in more learning. Now, again, learning's not being measured in this particular paper in their research. Rather, they're describing, here's how anxious the students feel during these four types of activities. Here's what the students report doing in terms of coping. And what I thought was really, really interesting is that the students report the highest levels of anxiety, relatively speaking, for answering questions, volunteering to answer questions, and cold calling. So more so than the group work and the clickers. And so this does kind of confirm that cold calling tends to produce more anxiety than some other strategies that we might use in the classroom that promote student learning or should promote student learning. But I thought it was really interesting that the two that were classified as the highest levelings of anxiety were volunteering to answer a question and or the cold calling. And oftentimes when we're talking about using cold calling, the options usually are, do we ask a student to volunteer to answer the question, or do we cold call? Now, of course, we could just take questions out of the equation altogether, but if we're engaging our students in this active learning, which I don't love that term because there's lots of different things that can be active, but don't necessarily promote learning, and things that don't look active that can. But in terms of the way this paper talks about it, these four active learning strategies should promote learning. And so we're not saying, let's not do that. Let's just lecture at the students and call it a day. Usually we're talking about, do we cold call or do we ask for a student to volunteer? And I really thought it was quite interesting that waiting for students to volunteer produced a fair amount of anxiety among the students anyway. And so if cold calling doesn't promote more anxiety than that alternative, and it does encourage students to covertly retrieve, then I think it's worth it. What I also thought was really, really valuable about this paper is that they reported from their qualitative analysis that when the students were reporting on how they cope with cold calling, they tend to report using adaptive strategies, specifically things like sort of self-talk, talking themselves up and helping themselves to feel better, or being prepared for class. And those types of things, being prepared for class, even seeking support, talking oneself up, and sort of tackling the problem head on, those things ought to also encourage learning. Whereas when The strategy, the active learning strategy being asked about was volunteering to answer questions. The students, by and large, reported using maladaptive strategies, specifically escape strategies, not making eye contact, not volunteering, just don't raise your hand, randomly guessing, or basically just trying to move things along. And so I think that the authors said it best in their discussion section. They basically were saying, look, we know that these active learning strategies tend to promote more anxiety among students than other types of courses, like, say, just lecturing. And so the instructors are left with a choice. We can either use these active strategies, and the research ought to try to figure out the best ways for students to cope with these, or the best ways for students to leverage and benefit from these active strategies, right? We can either do that, or we can just remove them from the class, but we do want to promote student learning. And the quote I want to use from their paper is, they said, active learning techniques improve student performance in STEM courses, so instructors are advised to use these practices despite their potential association with anxiety. Anxiety is not necessarily bad, as the strategies students use for coping with anxiety can have positive impacts on their performance. For example, if they respond by reading the textbook before attending class, they are more prepared for class. So I thought this was interesting, and I know that there are a number of people who have read the blog posts that I've written on this topic, and kind of people tend to feel strongly about cold calling. They think, well, that sounds like a nice idea for some reasons, but then they're worried about the student anxiety. And I thought that this paper provided a nice kind of description of the landscape, and suggested to me that maybe we don't worry so much about that anxiety, or we try to figure out ways to encourage students to use the adaptive coping strategies more to help alleviate their anxiety and empower them to use these strategies and to engage with these strategies in the classes so that they can improve learning. And it really does just sort of outline that future research in this area is necessary and would be really helpful. It would be nice to know of an evidence-based intervention that we could use, or a protocol or procedure in our classes, so that we could use some of these things more confidently, like cold calling and group work, while understanding evidence-based ways to alleviate student anxiety and promote student learning. So if you're interested in reading this paper, again, it's Jennifer Brigati and colleagues, published in 2020 in PLOS ONE, and the title was "How Do Undergraduates Cope with Anxiety Resulting from Active Learning Practices in Introductory Biology?"